Have you ever thought vampires were just fictional characters in movies and novels? Get ready for a journey that opens the door to hidden history. From remote European villages where people believed corpses rose at night, to the dazzling entrance of Dracula on stage and screen, and finally the wave of vampires dominating Netflix, TikTok, and even modern fashion, this story will leave you speechless. Don't miss the unknown truths and fresh perspectives on the vampire legend that has haunted humanity for thousands of years. If you love mysterious stories, ancient legends, and hidden historical secrets, subscribe to Tales Mythology today. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the world of myths and mysteries. Imagine this. A single candle burns in a room filled with ancient books. On the table lies a diary from the 14th century. The pages are cracked, the ink faded, but one line is still legible. We dug him up. He was too fresh. His eyes, they were open. What if I told you that the vampires we see on Netflix, stylish, romantic, occasionally glitter-skinned creatures, are only the tip of the iceberg? That behind the Hollywood charm and brooding good looks lies a history soaked in superstition, fear, and very real human tragedy. Tonight, we're traveling back through time, beyond Bram Stoker's Dracula, beyond Twilight and True Blood, even beyond the medieval myths you might have heard in passing. We're heading into the heart of forgotten villages, across continents, through plague-ridden towns, and into the flickering candlelight of superstition itself. Because the vampire-this creature of the night isn't just a monster, it's a mirror reflecting everything humanity has ever feared. Disease, death, temptation, immortality, the otherness lurking just outside the warm circle of the hearthfire. And tonight, we're going to uncover it all, how cultures separated by oceans and centuries somehow arrived at eerily similar creatures, why they've changed shape, voice, and meaning over time, and why, even now, they refuse to die. But be warned, some of these stories aren't for the faint of heart. Long before Dracula was charming London society, long before glittering vampires fell in love in Washington state, ancient civilizations whispered about beings who fed on the life of others. The first shadows. Our journey begins in Mesopotamia, of the first cities, the first laws, and some of the first nightmares. Here, under the burning sun and starlit deserts, people believed in Lamishtu and Lilichu, female demons who preyed upon infants and pregnant women, sometimes drinking their blood, sometimes stealing their breath. These weren't yet vampires as we know them, but the template was forming: nocturnal, life-stealing, terrifyingly persistent. Anthropologists suggest these myths often coincided with very real fears: infant mortality, disease outbreaks, and unexplained deaths in small villages. Imagine being a farmer in 2000, xenogerm theory. No medicine beyond herbs and prayers. A child dies suddenly, another falls sick. You want a reason, a name, something you can fight. So you invent one. Blood and shadows. The Greeks gave us words, democracy, philosophy, and creatures like Lamia. Lamia, according to myth, was cursed by the gods to devour children at night. Some tales say she drank their blood, others that she consumed their flesh. Her name became synonymous with a type of night-stalking demon blamed for sudden deaths. Even in Athens, the cradle of reason, people whispered about shadows with fangs. It tells you something important. The more we learn, the less power superstition should have. But fear doesn't vanish with knowledge. It mutates. It waits. Birth of the true vampire. If Mesopotamia planted the seed, Eastern Europe gave us the vampire we recognize today. In medieval Slavic folklore, there were the Strigarislas dead who rose from their graves to torment the living. These creatures looked disturbingly normal, at least at first. People described exhumed bodies as too fresh, with blood at the mouth, hair and nails seeming to grow even in death. Modern science explains this. Decomposition gases can swell corpses, push blood to the surface, make nails and hair appear longer as skin recedes. But imagine being a terrified peasant in 1400. You see a fresh corpse after a disease outbreak. What conclusion do you draw? That it's feeding. that it must be stopped. So they staked the bodies, burned them, sometimes even scattered the ashes in rivers to prevent resurrection. This wasn't just myth, it was ritual. Entire communities believed in it so fiercely that exhumations happened well into the 18th century. The vampire of Kisiljevo, one of the most famous cases, comes from Serbia, 1725. Villagers blamed Pet Blagojević for 10 years for a string of mysterious deaths. Witnesses swore they saw him wandering at night. A priest and officials exhumed his body. Reports say it looked remarkably intact, with fresh blood at the lips. The villagers didn't hesitate. They drove a stake through his heart. That night, the death stopped. Coincidence? Disease running its course? Mass hysteria? We may never know. But this case, among others, spread through Europe like wildfire, inspiring treatises, theological debates, even early medical studies on vampirism. Why these myths endured? Here's the key insight. Vampires gave people control. In an era when illness, famine, and death struck without warning, naming a culprit out of supernatural mud, the chaos feel conquerable. Plague killing your neighbors. Maybe it's the dead rising for revenge. Stake the corpse, save the village. It sounds absurd now, but psychologically, it gave people a sense of action in a world where they otherwise had none. If the medieval vampire was a muddy-handed revenant crawling out of a shallow grave, the 19th century vampire put on a tuxedo, lit a candle in a gothic manner, and began speaking in impeccable English. Something changed as Europe moved from the superstitious medieval era into the age of reason, industry, and empire. The vampire got classy. The rise of the literary vampire. In 1819, John Polidori's short story The Vampire introduced Lord Ruthven, a mysterious, aristocratic figure who seduced high society before draining the life from his victims. Critics at the time were fascinated and horrified. For the first time, the vampire wasn't a slobbering peasant ghoul. He was noble, sophisticated. He could walk into your drawing room wearing a velvet coat, ask for tea, and then drink something far more precious after midnight. Why this change? Because Victorian society had its own anxieties, sexual repression, fear of outsiders, moral hypocrisy. A monster hiding behind charm and refinement fit those fears perfectly. The immortal blueprint. And then came the big one, Dracula 1897. Bram Stoker didn't invent the vampire, but he created the vampire for the modern age. Count Dracula, lurking in a crumbling Transylvanian castle, sailing to London, bringing old world horror into the heart of modernity. This Dracula wasn't just about bloodsucking. He was about invasion, corruption, even xenophobia. Many scholars see the novel as reflecting Victorian fears about Eastern Europeans, disease, and the fragility of the British Empire. Yet Dracula was also strangely alluring. He was cultured, intelligent, tragic, even. Audiences hated and loved him in equal measure. A tension that still defines vampires today. Why it worked? Consider the setting: misty cemeteries, candlelit manors, wolves howling in the Carpathians. Gothic literature thrived on contrast: civilization versus wilderness, science versus superstition, reason versus desire. Vampires were the perfect embodiment of that clash. Ancient evil walking in a modern world. And let's be honest, readers loved a danger mixed with seduction. Dracula wasn't a mindless beast. He was a monster you could almost fall in love with. The cholera outbreaks. It's no coincidence that vampire panics often spiked during real-world crises. For example, during the 19th century cholera epidemics in Eastern Europe, rumors spread that vampires were behind the mysterious, wasting deaths. Medical science was advancing, but ordinary people still reached for supernatural explanations. The vampire became both metaphor and scapegoat. Invisible killer, foreign invader, unstoppable hunger. Sound familiar? Today, we do the same with zombies, aliens, even AI in sci-fi stories. The monster changes, the fear stays the same. By the time Dracula hit theaters in the 1930s, the vampire had moved from village folklore to global pop culture, and Hollywood was just getting started. But before we dive into modern cinema, let's look beyond Europe. Because vampires, they're everywhere. What's fascinating, that cultures separated by oceans without internet, without trade routes, in some cases still invented creatures eerily similar to vampires. It's as if the fear of something feeding on us at night is hardwired into the human psyche. The Aswang Philippines. In the Philippines, the Aswang is a shape-shifting creature Semitis appearing as a woman by day, a winged monster by night, who feeds on unborn children or sleeping villagers. Spanish colonizers recorded stories of the Aswang as early as the 16th century, noting how deeply the myth shaped rural life. People carried garlic, salt, even special daggers to ward them off. Here's the twist: the Aswang isn't always purely evil. Some tales blur the line between monster and misunderstood outcast, an idea that vampire stories embrace heavily. Rakshasa India. In India, we meet the Rakshasa, powerful beings from Hindu and Buddhist mythology. Some are blood drinkers, some are shape-shifters, others guard temples or cosmic treasures. Unlike the purely cursed European vampire, Rakshasas could be clever, even noble, depending on the story. They represent chaos, yes, but also the moral complexity of power itself. Jiangxi, China. China gives us the Jiangxi, or hopping vampire. These reanimated corpses, dressed in Qing dynasty robes, moved with stiff limbs, arms outstretched, draining the life force from victims. Taoist priests in legends used spells, bells, even peachwood swords to fight them. Entire ritual toolkits emerged around these creatures, blending folklore with religious practice. Interestingly, Jiangxi films in 1980s Hong Kong turned them into horror comedy icons long before Hollywood made What We Do in the Shadows. Chupacabra, Latin America. Fast forward to the 1990s, Puerto Rico reports strange livestock deaths. Goats drained of blood. Witnesses describe a small, fanged creature as chupacabra. Skeptics blame wild dogs or coyotes. Believers insist it's something stranger. Either way, the legend spreads across Latin America like wildfire, proving vampire myths aren't relics, they adapt to modern fears. By the early 20th century, the vampire had already conquered literature. But when the silver screen came calling, this creature of the night became truly immortal. And it all began with a single shadow on a staircase, the birth of cinematic horror. Silent film audiences in 1920 to Germany watched in terror as Count Orlok crept through shadowy doorways in Nosferatu. Played by the legendary Max Schreck, whose very name means terror in German. Orlok wasn't suave or romantic. He was hideous, bald head, rat-like teeth, long claws. But Nosferatu did something revolutionary. It showed the vampire stalking, creeping, feeding, no longer confined to the imagination. The monster was right there, flickering in black and white horror across the screen. The film borrowed heavily from Dracula, but changed names after Stoker's widow sued the production. Ironically, the lawsuit only fueled the film's legend, making it a cult classic still studied a century later. Bela Lugosi and the age of Gothic cinema. Then came Bela Lugosi, 1931, sweeping onto the screen in a cape and thick Hungarian accent. "I am Dracula." With those words, the vampire transformed again. Lugosi's Dracula was hypnotic, elegant, theatrical, a creature as comfortable in a ballroom as in a crypt. Audiences were spellbound. The film's success launched decades of Gothic horror, from Frankenstein to the Wolfman, but Dracula always reigned supreme. Hammer horror and the rise of the monster star. In the 1950s and 60s, Britain's Hammer Horror Studios revived Dracula in glorious Technicolor, with Christopher Lee bringing feral intensity to the role. This was a Dracula with blood-red eyes and sharper fangsless romance, more raw power. Lee barely spoke in some films, his presence alone terrified, and yet audiences loved him. The vampire was no longer just a villain, he was an icon. The romantic vampire awakens. By the 1970s and 80s, something changed again. Vampires started getting sexy. And Rice's Interview with the Vampire 1976 gave us Louis and Lestat, immortal, tortured, tragic figures questioning morality, love, and loneliness. Films like The Hunger 1983 and Bram Stoker's Dracula 1992 into gothic sensuality, casting vampires as both predator and object of desire. Suddenly, the bite on the neck wasn't just terrifying, it was intimate, erotic, dangerous in more ways than one. The vampire subculture. This shift spilled into reality. By the late 20th century, real-life vampire subcultures emerged in cities like New Orleans and Los Angeles. People who dressed like vampires held themed gatherings, some even claiming to drink blood consensually. Sociologists studying these groups noted they often saw vampirism as identity and empowerment, not just play acting. The vampire, once a curse, had become a lifestyle symbol. Twilight, True Blood, and TikTok vampires. Then came the pop culture explosion. Twilight turned vampires into brooding, sparkling romantic leads for a generation. True Blood mixed Southern Gothic with political allegory, exploring prejudice and desire through vampire-human coexistence. What We Do in the Shadows 2014 onward spun the whole myth into comedy, proving vampires could survive even as parody. And today, TikTok is full of vampire aesthetic, spell makeup, velvet fashion, quotes from Dracula remixes. The undead, it seems, never go out of style. But beneath all the glitter, humor, and romance, the vampire still carries deep cultural weight. To understand why, we need to look at what these stories really say about us. Why do vampires endure while so many other monsters fade? Because vampires aren't just creatures of the night. They're mirrors reflecting what each era fears, desires, or hides from itself. Forbidden desire and repression. In Victorian times, when public morality was strict but private scandals thrived, the vampire embodied sexual transgression. Dracula's bite was intimate, invasive, thrilling, every polite society repressed. Modern vampires keep this theme alive. True Blood used vampires as metaphors for LGBTQ+ struggles. Twilight hinted at abstinence and temptation. Every generation twists the myth to match its cultural battles. Addiction, power, and otherness. Many modern stories portray vampirism like addiction, uncontrollable hunger, cycles of guilt and relapse. Shows like The Vampire Diaries explore this through sympathetic characters torn between morality and survival. Others use vampires to examine power, mortality, wealth, influence. Who gets to live forever? Who gets consumed? These questions echo real-world anxieties about inequality and exploitation. Environmental and existential themes. Some recent works even cast vampires as metaphors for climate change, a parasitic species draining the planet, unable to stop itself. And always, underneath it all, vampires tap into humanity's oldest fear, death itself. What would you trade to escape it? Your soul, your humanity. Would immortality be a gift or a curse? The Highgate Vampire. In 1970s London, rumors spread of a vampire haunting Highgate Cemetery. Witnesses claimed to see a tall, dark figure gliding among the tombs. The media frenzy sparked nighttime hunts, with people carrying stakes and garlic into the graveyard. Of course, no vampire was ever found, but the story reveals something timeless. Even in the modern age, part of us wants to believe. At this point, we've seen the vampire evolve from ancient demon to romantic anti-hero, from scapegoat to superstar. But what happens next, as our world changes faster than ever? Space travel, climate fierce, what will vampires become in the stories of tomorrow? That's where we head next. The vampire has survived every era because it keeps changing. What began as a superstition in rural villages became Gothic poetry, then Hollywood icon, then romantic hero, then internet meme. Each age remade the vampire in its own image. So what comes next? Vampires in the age of technology. Imagine the 22nd century. Digital immortality, AI consciousness, billionaires chasing life extension tech. Would a vampire even need blood in a world where data is life? Could a vampire feed on memories instead of flesh? Some sci-fi authors already explore this. Stories feature cyber vampires draining energy grids or uploading their minds into virtual realities to escape sunlight forever. The message: Our fears about technology will eventually creep into vampire myths the way plague once did. Eco-vampires and climate change. As rising seas and wildfires dominate headlines, storytellers may recast vampires as symbols of environmental collapse, predators draining a planet too weak to fight back. A vampire who refuses to feed could become a heroic metaphor for restraint, sustainability, even rebellion against a doomed system. Interplanetary vampires. And if humanity colonizes Mars or beyond, will our monsters follow? Picture a crimson Martian desert at night. A research team goes missing. Survivors whisper about something moving in the domes, something that doesn't need oxygen. Myth always mutates to fit new frontiers. Space will be no different. The return to horror roots. Even now, filmmakers are circling back to scarier vampires, less sparkle, more shadow. Midnight Mass 2021 on Netflix returned to religious, gothic terror. Indie films explore vampirism as psychological horror again, proving the myth never stays in one box for long. So the future. Expect variety. Romantic anti-heroes, cybernetic predators, eco-gothic monsters, maybe even vampire astronauts. Because as long as humans have fears and desires, the vampire will have fresh blood to drink. And so, after wandering through centuries of superstition, literature, cinema, and subculture, what have we learned? The vampire began as a terrified villager's explanation for plague. It became a Victorian metaphor for temptation, a Hollywood superstar, a romantic anti-hero, even a TikTok aesthetic. It has been demon, lover, villain, comedian, rebel, philosopher. Why does it endure? Because the vampire is never really about the vampire. It's about us, our fear of death, our craving for immortality, our shame and desire and contradictions. When we tell vampire stories, we're talking to ourselves about power, love, hunger, control, loss, otherness, survival. That's why it doesn't matter whether tomorrow's vampire lives in a castle, a nightclub, or a cyberpunk megacity. It will always find a way to haunt us. Because the undead, they change shape, they adapt, just like our fears do. And maybe that's the real secret to immortality.